I'm doing my best.
And it's good. I like your best, Gene.
It's good. Thank you. I like your best too.
Thank you.
Welcome to Shat on TV Lovecraft Country, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the new HBO series, Lovecraft Country. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me is my co-host, Ash Lafley.
Hi, y'all.
And this is our deep dive edition where we look back on this week's episode of Lovecraft Country, which is episode 8, Jig-a-Bobo, and provide our thoughts and analysis plus top listener email and voicemail for the week. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss an episode. You can do that wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting shatontv.com/subscribe. And we'll have an instant reaction live stream every Sunday night on Twitch immediately after Lovecraft Country. You can find that at shatontv.com/Twitch. Please join us there. It's always a lively discussion. This week's was much more upbeat than last week's, Ash. And we had so much to research this week that it's been a busy 24 hours.
It has been. I was just telling you off air, I actually learned some things this week that I knew a little bit about, like I knew surface level things about it, but it was really interesting because this episode had so many fantastic cultural references that are coming and tying together that I was telling you, I fell into a little bit of a research hole today in between meetings, and it was pretty fascinating. So I'm excited to kind of dive in and talk about some of this stuff tonight.
And this episode maybe gave you a brain boner. For me, it was a very emotional episode. I found myself, the more and more I thought about the moments, the more I was writing about them as I was thinking of what we would talk about in tonight's podcast. I started thinking, man, I've got some really strong feelings about this. So some of this conversation tonight, guys, will be kind of off the cuff. We're not necessarily purely logical or purely research. And we hope you kind of enjoy that different take on the podcast. It's not something we normally do, but I think in this episode, there was so much that appealed to the humanity that it deserves talking about. But Ash, before we get to the topics we're going to cover tonight, what stood out most to you about this episode, episode 8?
So I think this is the first opportunity for us to really see how the plot's beginning to connect together. This has kind of been an anthology series where each episode has been so disparate in terms of the greater plot. And in this episode, things started to connect finally. And I was really glad to see that. It certainly made the viewing experience a bit easier for me because I get kind of frustrated when things don't seem to connect. Also, first 2 genuine jump scares that I've had in the whole season were in this episode. I love the creepy little girls. I'm a huge horror fan, and this episode was pure horror, which was awesome. I also, I had said last week that I was kind of hoping that this would be a Stephen King inspired episode, and I think you definitely got that with Dianna's storyline. You know, the whole idea of that grown-ups, it's not that they just don't understand kids' experiences, it's that they belittle and don't value the children's experience. And that's what most of his books, like It and things like that, are about. And that was clearly a huge piece of this. You know, when they're having that huge debate outside of the funeral of what Dee should see or shouldn't see, they're having it right in front of her, like she doesn't even exist. And they don't even ask what her opinion is. And that just dials up the isolation Dee is feeling, which helps to dial up that horror and the fear. And I thought that was really smart this time around.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Ash, with pure horror. I think this was some of the best horror elements we've seen from the series. I mean, genuinely spooky stuff, and it's apt that we're moving into October now, so maybe that was perfectly timed. But, you know, the radio changing, the book cover changing, that's spookier than any CGI monster you're ever going to see. I also felt that they dialed it up when it came to action, when it came to emotion, just a better episode overall. And I think one of the most original arguments we've seen as a white audience. Many members of the audience that we've spoken with have said, yeah, these are all lessons of freedom. These are all lessons of injustice. These are all lessons of minority identity in America, but it's stuff we've seen and heard before. I think they really did a great job in this episode of incorporating these newer arguments, the newer way of seeing things that we might have as a country just started examining. Also, we got a lot of progress on the plot. I mean, Atticus went to the future. We find out that George Freeman is his son, and that's where the book comes from. The mark of Cain can be used to heal. I mean, we are speeding along now. It almost feels like if we took a breather in episode 6, episode 8 is just propelling us headlong into the end of the series. So the topics we're going to cover in the podcast tonight, some of them come from our own ideas of what we wanted to cover after watching the episode. Some of them come from the audience on Twitch. And again, if you ever want to join us live, you can go to shatontv.com/Twitch on Sunday night immediately after the episode and catch us there, have a conversation with us. We had like more than 40 people this last week, and I know there's more of you out there. So please do join us. Don't be intimidated. You don't need to download an app or anything like that. But the topics we're going to discuss tonight are Topsey and Bobsey, as you said, these two monster girls that were chasing Dee around. We're also going to talk about Emmett Till. A lot of people feel like they're familiar with some of the subjects that appeared in this episode, but I think a lot of us are familiar at a cursory level, and there's another level that we may not appreciate. I know that both of us found some additional knowledge this week. So we're going to be covering Emmett Till. We're also going to talk about the attack on Christina and what it means. Some people were confused by that scene, and there is a lot to uncover there. Also talking about race relations as they're shown in interactions in this episode, a very, very complex topic. And then, of course, we have several letters and voicemail to get to, so we're going to devote a good chunk of the podcast to that. But Ash, I am excited to hear what you dug up on Topsey and Bobsey. I have no clue about either of these characters, these monsters, and I'm here for the education.
So this is my favorite part of the series so far, was the use of these two little girls, both in terms of just the pure horror that they represent, because they were fucking terrifying. I mean, they genuinely were. There's this one moment, they're both dancers. And so there's this one moment where the little girl who's playing Bobsey, she goes into a full back bend, and it's set to like this amazing music. And it is so scary when she just goes, whoop, back like that. And it's just like, wow, like you're dealing with like supernatural beings here. And it was great. But as much as I love the horror aspect, I also think these are some of the smartest cultural references that our showrunners are giving us in the show so far. And so to understand this part of the show and these crazy, terrifying almost twin girls, you kind of have to dive into the world of the book that Dee has on her shelf that she sees morph, which kind of starts off this whole scary section, which is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So if you aren't familiar with the book, these two girls are based off of and kind of inspired by characters within Uncle Tom's Cabin. So the twins in this episode, as we've said, they're credited as Topsey and Bobsey. But in the book, which came out in 1852, they are called Eva and Topsey. So Eva is a little white girl, and she's portrayed in the book as angelic. She can really do no wrong. And Topsey is her antithesis. She's mischievous. She's a black girl that is a slave. And in the novel, Stowe really describes Topsey like she appears here in our show. She has very, very dark complexion. She has shiny, what she describes as round eyes. Her hair is in a bunch of braids that Harriet Beecher Stowe writes wildly stick out all over her head. And she's always written to be kind of dirty. Like she isn't as well kempt as Eva is.
And the year Uncle Tom's Cabin was released is significant here because it's 1852. The song that we hear as we're introduced to these monsters in Dee's room is called Stop That Knocking, which is from 1847. And it's a minstrel tune. A lot of times in Lovecraft Country, we get these anachronistic mashups of music from a different period matched up with the show from the 50s. So you think about like, Cardi B being on here. But here we have a book from 1852 being matched up with music from 1847. With regard to minstrel shows, I realized today that many of our listeners, thankfully, have never been exposed to the concept of a minstrel show. A minstrel show basically was think of like a variety show, almost like a burlesque show, but it's making fun of Africans and people of African descent, right? And people at the time would say, well, this isn't offensive. This is just having fun, right? It's just a different form of entertainment, kind of something you might hear today. But these were horribly warped depictions. So these characters, often it was white people in blackface. Sometimes it was black people. the depictions were that Africans and people of African descent were stupid or silly or subhuman, kind of happy-go-lucky a lot. And that's how the lyrics were, and that's how the music was for the musical numbers. I first thought that Lovecraft Country was filled with Easter eggs. And then I changed my opinion. I said, it's filled with a lesson plan for us. And now I'm starting to think that it's not Easter eggs or a lesson plan. These are terrors that we never noticed or that we forgot, right? That at the time seemed normal and then were forgotten. And Lovecraft Country is doing us the painful favor of bringing these topics back up and saying, hey, nobody noticed it then we forgot about it. Now, when we look at it, it looks horrible and scary and ugly, and it's time to address these topics.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up minstrel shows because there was a very famous duo of a pair of sisters, Vivian and Rosetta Duncan, who for 30 years performed a minstrel show that was entitled the Tom Show, Topsey and Eva. And they performed it in front of tens of thousands of crowds domestically and abroad. They toured all over Europe doing this, and they were hugely famous. And it was portraying these two characters that are in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Eva and Topsey. And I think that, so if you've ever read Uncle Tom's Cabin, you understand it's an anti-slavery book, right? Like that's the purpose of the book. And it was a very brave piece of literature, but a big critique of the book, if you can have one, is that Stowe kind of failed in a way because she painted the characters in such distinct stereotypical ways that it almost gave power to a lot of racist stereotypes that already existed. So Topsy is portrayed as mischievous, and it's supposed to be a way for us to see how ridiculous these stereotypes are. But in a lot of white circles, it reinforced the idea that little black girls were misbehaving all the time and that they were thieves and liars. That was something that gave power to. And a perfect example of this is the image that Topsy kind of produced. So there was this image of big red lips, dark skin, dirty and unkempt braids. It was a big caricature, and it became a cartoon that was used over and over again in anti-Black material, racist writings, visual representations, all through the Jim Crow era. This was a big thing that was utilized, and it was actually referred to as the pickaninny stereotype, that's what Topsy was. And it's because of the fact that a lot of white audiences were so far removed and so out of touch with what was going on that they read Stowe's novel and they took it as reinforcement rather than as a way to point out and highlight their own misgivings and stereotyping.
I think that most of us were taught in school that Uncle Tom's Cabin, you didn't have to read it. You weren't told what it was all about or who the characters were. You're just like, oh, it's that anti-slavery book, right? But we don't realize that sometimes even the seemingly progressive can be problematic because it's not digested in the right way by the public. It's misheard. And we see echoes of that as well with some of the advertising that we see on the walls in this episode too, kind of reinforcing that stereotype. If you think about it, Cream of Wheat, Aunt Jemima, those were brands that featured Black mascots or Black figures, but in a wholly unrealistic way.
Well, and they were Black figures that white people were okay with accepting, right? Because that's the issue here. That's what they're highlighting is it was okay to have Aunt Jemima in your kitchen because she was this Mamie type character, right? And so it was okay to have her there because everybody loved Gone with the Wind that was white, right? And then you've got, Uncle Ben. He's the nice, kind of older, safe Black man that's okay to have in your house. And there's something that's at play here culturally that also is similar to that. So clearly we're inspired here by Eva and Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin, but there's another cultural reference that a lot of people picked up on in this episode, which are topsy-turvy dolls. Now, this is something that I think a lot of the white audience is not familiar with at all, are this idea of topsy-turvy dolls. So I'll post a picture on Instagram and on Twitter just so people can see, because it's kind of difficult to explain. But basically, they were these dolls that was half white and half Black. And so when the white doll was being shown, the dress of the white doll covered the black figure. And when the black doll was being shown, the dress of the black doll covered the white figure. So it could only ever be black or white. It couldn't be both at the same time. And the white doll was the matron of the house, the white slave owner. That's what she looked like. She was this beautiful angelic figure. And the black doll was very much like a Black housemaid, a house slave, because these came about in popularity during the late 19th century. Around the time when the Civil War was being fought, these were hugely popular. And then they saw this huge resurgence in the early 20th century. They came back around. And actually, as recently as like 2015, there was a huge push for these again with collectors, and people have them in their homes and their personal collections. The same way people, maybe this is just a Deep South thing, but there are people in the Deep South who collect like Aunt Jemima dolls and collect these figurines from, you know, a time period when slavery was still very much around. But the whole point of talking about these is that when we look at them as social scientists, they're very confusing, because it's kind of like, well, what were these supposed to mean? Like, what was the purpose of them? And some historians, they believe that they were for the children of slaves and white owners to use to play together, because most often in the kind of arrangement in these plantation homes is that if slaves had children that were similar in age to the plantation owners' children, they put them together, because the slave children were meant to be kind of servants to the children beginning at that age, and also to kind of start teaching them their place immediately. So that's what a lot of people think. And there's a lot of other social scientists that extend that to say that they were this visual reminder of how different whites and blacks were meant to be. And if you think about it, children begin to learn their place in the world through play, the way that they interact with each other. So who makes the rules when they play? Even something as simple as hide and seek. Who's the one setting the house rules? Who's doing the seeking? Who's doing the hiding? It's political from the get-go. Play is a very political thing amongst children, and they learn their place in society, what roles they're supposed to play. That's why gender stereotyping is so dangerous with young children, because if you only buy dolls for a girl and you only buy monster trucks for a boy, you're teaching them what role they're supposed to play from the beginning, and it socializes them in a way that isn't really fair to their own development. So with that concept and the idea that these play concepts bleed over into real life, these topsy-turvy dolls were a genuine representation of the difference between Black and white. And it was the fact that they could never actually coexist together. There could only ever be one at a time, meaning that the mixing of races and the mixing, and not just in terms of children and sex, but also like the genuine just social mixing of races, was not something that was ever going to be possible. And that's what was being taught to children who played with them.
And if people think this sounds theoretical or that it sounds like way too highbrow, this is real. Mm-hmm. Ash, you and I recently covered Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom for Shat the Movies, which will be coming out soon. Guys, please check it out. I think it's going to be a good one. And I realized while we were recording that I experienced the movie differently from you or Big D, which is not to say that you guys are insensitive, and it's not to say that you don't understand all the issues that I raised. And we can laugh about it because we're friends, and I know you both respect me as a human, but this isn't about you guys. This is about me, because I realized after watching this movie and my reaction to it that there's this core indoctrination from play as a kid, from the cartoons I watched and the toys I played with and the posters I had on my wall, that I'll probably never be able to escape. And that's it, thinking that a white life is more valuable than a brown one. As a brown person, play is very political, and it sticks with people for life.
It does. And that's kind of what, to bring it back to the episode, that's what we're seeing with Dee here. She is going through this phase of understanding that nobody sees her pain. So her friend, who is a fellow child, has just died. And because she is a child, she isn't given a say in anything, including how to mourn her friend and how to mourn for why he died and her own place in the society that killed him. And so her pain is almost overlooked. And the white people that are around, they view her as a future problem. She's a kid now, but eventually she's just going to be another Black person that they have to deal with that they believe is underneath them. And that's really haunting on a societal level, just when we think theoretically. And the literal images of that fate, her becoming the Topsey character, that is the fate that haunts her here. And like, I have goosebumps right now because it's absolutely brilliant and so powerful and so moving. If nothing else happens that I like, if I hate the way that it closes, if nothing actually connects, if it's a stupid fucking ending, whatever, I'm glad that I watched this show just to see such a brilliant depiction of the Black experience in a way that I could understand in my own experience. And I'm not saying I understand like I would if I were a part of the Black community, but as a white viewer that is watching and trying to learn and educate myself, I was so excited and honored to be a part of this retelling of my own horrific history and how my own ancestors played into this and the effect that it had that trickles down today into what we're seeing in 2020.
So earlier in the series, Ash, we had the Ouija board scene in which we saw Bobo, who is Emmett Till. And some viewers this week didn't really put that together. They were asking, okay, so how does Emmett Till fit into this? So Bobo, we saw him twice before. And even then we were like, man, this would be a real cheapening of the memory of Emmett Till if the only thing we get is this vague illusion during a Ouija board game. And in fact, no, the show does come back to Emmett Till and his story in episode 8.
My initial apologies to anybody out there who lives and breathes this experience and knows who Emmett Till is. But we do have a large swath of our listening audience that has said, okay, I kind of know Emmett Till, but like, tell me a little bit more about him. So we wanted to take the opportunity to do that there. And guys, please know we are on a time crunch. We could talk a whole podcast about Emmett Till and the ramifications of the horrors that happened to him. So please know we're not trying to belittle what happened by shoving this all in like a 5-minute segment, but we wanted to give a broad yet concise overview of who this character in the show and the real life individual was. So let's do a quick recap here. So Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy. He lived in Chicago and he went down to the Deep South to the Delta in Mississippi to visit family in the summer of 1955. He was specifically in this little bitty town that's called Money, Mississippi. It's basically even today like a gas station and like 3 stores. It's really not much. But he was there visiting his great uncle and other family members. And one day a group of friends, a group of boys and a young lady that were all Black got out of their car at a store. It was basically like a general store. They were going to get snacks. And so they were just messing around like young kids do. And Emmett Till was bragging about how his girl back home was white. And so his friends started, talking to him about that. And again, like young boys do, they're like, oh, sure. Kind of like the whole thing today, like if your girlfriend lives in Canada, right? Like, people call you out on that. And so they were calling him out on it. And so there was a white woman who was working at the store. She was her husband owned the store. Her name was Carolyn Bryant. And they basically egged him on because she was white. Like if you get white girls, then go get her. Right. And so he went in and very innocently made a very slight comment to her that was not offensive. It was not anything brash. He didn't assault her. He just was a boy joking, feeling his oats, made a comment to this woman. And she would wind up over the course of the next couple of days when her husband came back in town. She accused Till basically of assaulting her, grabbing her hips, saying super vulgar things, what at the time was called a wolf whistle, which we would basically call like catcalling today. It was a big deal back then. And her husband, Carolyn Bryant's husband, and her brother-in-law basically decided they were going to teach Emmett Till a lesson. And so the night of August 28th, 1955, they went to his great uncle's house and they forcibly removed him. They brought him to a location, basically to like a barn, and they beat him, they pistol whipped him, they tortured him, and eventually brought him to another location where they forced him to strip naked. They shot him, they gouged out an eye. They tied his body with barbed wire to a cotton gin fan, which they weigh about 75 pounds each. So they tied his body to it and they dropped him in the Tallahatchie River. 72 hours later, a group of boys were fishing, saw a pair of feet, and it was unfortunately Emmett Till's body. He was so horribly mutilated by what they did to him and the way that they tortured him that the only way he was identified is that he had a ring on his finger that belonged to his father. And so this would have been horrifying enough. But Emmett Till's mother, who was devastated, obviously, about the fate of her son, they brought his body back to Chicago. And what you're seeing in this episode actually happened in real life, which is that his mother insisted on having an open casket because she didn't want to bury, no pun intended, the evidence of the horrors of white racism and what people in the Deep South were allowed to do to Black men and Black boys and Black women. And so over 50,000 people over the course of 3 days saw his body. They went and paid their respects and viewed. Photographs of his body were published in multiple magazines and publications. And this truly, it cannot be overstated that it was truly the spark that began what eventually would become the full-blown civil rights movement. Rosa Parks talked about how she stayed on that bus in her seat because of Emmett Till's memory. The Montgomery bus protests began just months later. People were furious because he gave a face, unfortunately, both a beautiful face as a young boy and then a horrible mutilated face. Looking at those side by side, it gave a face to the racism. And the last thing I'll say on this is we talk so much about Emmett Till, but today I actually pulled the original news articles that covered the Emmett Till murders. And there is a publication after the two killers were acquitted. They were acquitted by a jury of all men that were white in the Deep South. They were acquitted, basically saying that they did not murder this man, that they acted in their own self-defense for what they did to him. And these two men, and you'll notice I haven't said their names because their names don't deserve to be remembered. Emmett Till's name does. So we do know their names. I'm just intentionally not saying them. But these two men recounted play by play how they murdered him, how they tortured him, and they couldn't do anything to them because of double jeopardy laws. And so I read the article that was written in this magazine where they recount all of this. And it was horrifying enough to read that, but I read the comment section. So people compiled letters to the editor that were written to this magazine. And more often than not, it was support for what they had done, that if that had been their wife or their child, that they only wish that they could have participated with them. I mean, there were hundreds of letters to the editor that echoed support for what these two brutal murderers did to Emmett Till. And both luckily would die very painfully of cancer later on in life, which I think is karma. But it was just horrifying to have watched this episode and be learning all that we are, diving into everything that we are, to read the true voices of what that time period was, and to not just see Emmett Till's mother in these photographs, but to read the words about what people had to say about him.
And as a testament to how horrific that mutilation was, note that Leti says that she didn't have the courage to take pictures. After all the things that she's witnessed, after all the things that she stood up to bravely, after all the things that she's photographed, this was the thing that she could not take a picture of. And Ruby says he looked like a monster. And make no mistake that mutilation is just that. People don't mutilate bodies to kill the person. They mutilate the body to make the person look monstrous. It is hate in its most direct and physical form. And I don't want to tell anybody to do anything that's going to trigger them. But if you haven't seen the photos, like, it's something I think everyone should see. It is what hate looks like to me. It's something that sticks with you.
It is. And we have the final piece of my part of this podcast is we have this performance that Christina does at the end. And it is truly a performative death that she goes through. So she has that bone-chilling scene with Ruby earlier in the episode where she tells her very honestly that she doesn't care about Emmett Till. She doesn't care about the social movement, that none of it matters to her. And then at the end of the episode, she's basically testing out if her Mark of Cain works, if it truly is an invulnerability spell, if it truly works on her. And she pays these two men to kill her in the exact same manner that Emmett Till was murdered. And the guy, one of the men says, who the fuck would want to die like that? Basically, this is ridiculous. And I think what was so brilliant about this is and I'm speaking specifically to the white audience here, because I think it was directed to people who look like me and people who don't have the Black experience, people who have more of Christina's experience. They put this horrendous violence that the Black community has had to sit with and be saddled with. And now today it's cops killing them in the streets, right? That death has not ended. That threat has not stopped. That Montrose talks about, where he says, I always picture that I would die at the end of a rope or a bullet from a white man. That is part of and inherent to the Black experience in America, both in 1955 and today. And they put that violence on a white body that has never been saddled with that reality. And we were forced to watch it. And what's so smart about it is we were forced to watch it on a body that we knew would survive it, which is exactly what happens in the white experience. And one of the ways that is so vastly different from the Black experience is that when I get pulled over by a cop, which I did today because I was going 95 on the toll road, and I got pulled over by a cop, and the cop walked up to the door and I said, I'm so sorry, officer. I said, I was going really fast. I was listening to a song that I get really excited about, and I drove really fast. And he laughed, asked what song it was. I played a piece of it for him. He kind of giggled and sang along. And then he said, you know what, ma'am, have a nice day. And he walked back to his car. I've been pulled over countless times. You can ask my husband, I've never gotten a ticket because I am a blonde white woman. I'm not afraid when a cop pulls me over. I'm pissed when a cop pulls me over. I start thinking of excuses to charm the police officer, right? That is my privilege in action. It's the same here. Christina has privilege. That mark of Cain, that invulnerability, is a metaphor, you guys, for the invulnerability that every white person in 1955 has when it comes to their interactions with the police, their interactions with other people, and their interactions in a fucking convenience store when they hit on a woman in a joking way because they're a little boy. It's the same type of invulnerability. And I think the irony of that, the tragedy in that irony, and then just the horror of the realization that still today we're having to say Black Lives Matter in 2020. We still have to say that because Emmett Till's death was not enough. George Floyd's death has not been enough. Breonna Taylor's death has not been enough. There's not been, we could list name after name after name, and it would fill t-shirts and billboards and the streets of the amount of people who have been brutalized because of existing while Black. And watching what happens to Christina here and going, wow, that mark of Cain and that specific evil mark of Cain, right? In Christian theology, that's not a good mark to have, and looking at that, I was so moved by it and so convicted in my own privilege that I rewound it and I made myself watch it again and then go back and read about Emmett Till and then watch it again. And it was so powerful. And I'm so glad that they put us, meaning people who look like me, on the receiving end of that, because a lot of white people, like those people who wrote into the magazine, they're not going to listen at all until they see it happen to a white body.
She comes out laughing. She's laughing about the situation, and it was fun. And that brings me to the idea of race relations in this episode that I think was beautifully illustrated in several different relationships. First, I want to talk about that Ruby and Christina interaction, since it ties so closely to Christina's performative death. Surprise, but that super bloody sex scene between Ruby and William and the conversation that she has later with Christina, it's not just about sex. It's not just about gore, and it's not just about these two characters. This is, to me, a stand-in for the relationship between Black bodies and America. We see after the sex that they have the conversation, and Ruby says that she took that potion to turn white because she didn't want William to have her as Ruby, right? She wanted to change it to the white version, the Hillary version. Christina counters and says, no, you took that potion because you wanted to distance yourself from being a woman with wants at an inappropriate time, right? A woman who has her own needs at an inappropriate time when you should be thinking of something greater. In those spaces, that's what we call intersectionality, right? It's when your identity, your responsibilities, the situation that you're in, all those things interact. Whether it's to be Black and to be a woman, whether it's to be successful and also to be oppressed. And we see in all of this that there is a clear burden to being Black in America. For instance, you have to make a career for yourself without being owned by anyone, right? There's being adored by someone, but always asking yourself, am I being fetishized? Am I being seen as a person, or am I being seen as an object, a body? It's incredibly difficult, and it's a complex existence. And I think they're exploring that so powerfully in the show. And again, when we're talking about white privilege, and I know that's a buzzword, I know that people are tired of hearing it, but it means not having to deal with all that. Like, you don't have to wonder that thing. If you are a white woman and someone says you're beautiful, you probably think it's because you're beautiful. Or when you're moving up in the world and you're making sacrifices for your career, you're not asking, am I being owned increasingly by this person? I mean, you might in the capitalist sense, but not to the degree of a person who's literally believing, am I submitting myself to a system of oppression? All that comes from the interaction between essentially 2/3 characters. That's what television is capable of at its best. And other people have written in and said, this show is the how are we going to kill white people this week show, or this show is the white people are bad all the time show. I think that's okay. I mean, that is a fair assessment of Lovecraft Country. Every white character is bad. I don't think there's a good one in here. But this episode goes a step further. It gets a little bit more sophisticated in adding that additional threat that we haven't really put under the microscope, and that's the status quo. This is the idea, when people say that there's no room for politics in sports, people say there's no room for politics in entertainment, when people say, can't we just get back to, how peaceful it was 10 years ago? Guys, that's the status quo. And that's displayed in the scene with that man in the street who accosts Ruby. The Black community of Chicago is seeing Emmett Till's death as a tragedy. The white community sees it as a disturbance. Oh no, it could spread to the rest of the city. And that's not too far from what's happening, in our country today. That the concept of keeping things just as they are, that directly benefits one side of the argument and not the other. And you don't even need that friction between the white and Black community in this episode. You have friction within the Black community itself as another aspect of race relations. The opening of this episode shows characters at Emmett Till's death who are advocating the Black community taking a stand after his death and his mutilation, that, those cries of no more. And yet in the same episode, we're seeing that there's fragmentation within the community itself. Dee is walking down the street and she's furious at the death of her friend. And she sees little girls playing in the street and she's throwing rocks at them because they're having a different experience than she is at the time. We've seen Leti and Ruby disagreeing on whether the right response to hurdles in your career is to power yourself over them. By picking yourself up by your bootstraps, so to speak, or pushing through them by knocking those systems down. And I think what we're seeing here in this very specific time period, the 1950s, is a period when Black America was in a transition point. And that's carrying through to today, but it's so smart to show that this is not a monolithic culture. This is not a single identity. There are thousands, millions of people experiencing it differently within the Black community. And that gave birth to different ideas and different politics on how to deal with the whole thing. Okay, now deep breath, and let's get into some odds and ends. If that was painful, it was supposed to be. Mm-hmm. I want to point out the voiceover in this episode. We always take a moment to acknowledge what anachronistic voiceover they put into the episode. And this time it was a speech given by a young girl named Naomi Wadler at March for Our Lives. So if this sounds like it was given at a civil rights rally, yes and no, right? So March for Our Lives was a gathering of students to speak out against gun violence after school shootings. But Naomi Wadler took the moment to say, you know what, let's also acknowledge the fact that a Black life is worth less than a white life. In particular, a Black girl's life is worth less. She's Ethiopian. She was adopted by American parents and a very, very powerful speaker. And so she then went on to kind of speak on this issue of gun violence and the way it affects Black lives. And again, when we talk about all these topics that led up to this final moment of the episode, it all makes sense here. We're talking about a person of color seeing themselves as lesser than white. We're talking about race relations. We're talking about intersectionality. We're talking about white people's insulation from some of the threats to blacks. This all comes through in this speech. And again, I think that they hit the nail on the head every week with these voiceovers. On the more fun side of things, we had the Chicago American Giants hat that Dee was wearing. I recognize that immediately as a White Sox fan. The White Sox sometimes wear those throwback jerseys of the Chicago American Giants. It's a cool tribute to the Chicago Negro League team, the Chicago American Giants, who were like a dominant force before sort of being phased out as baseball became more integrated. We also get a peek at Lovecraft Country, the book, as it's tucked back in the back of Atticus's trousers. And he also talks about it a little bit here with this huge reveal, really fun reveal that the book was written by George Freeman, not the George we've seen on screen, but rather his son. And it allows us to explain to the audience that there's the book version, which we do not talk about on this podcast, and the TV version, which we're watching.
And I thought it was cute. That little meta moment I thought was wonderful when Atticus basically describes the whole plot of the book, and it's the plot of like the actual Lovecraft Country book and all of the changes they made. I like a good meta moment when it's funny, and this was really clever and charming, I thought.
And just so we don't leave this character out of this deep dive, Gia appears in Chicago in this episode. Super awkward. Got to say, this has got to be one of the worst breakups ever. I mean, you left her in South Korea after she basically penetrated your orifices. I think that's a pretty reasonable breakup, right? I think you're done there. But beyond all that, there is really never a reason for your ex to meet your new girlfriend. Just don't do it, guys. When Atticus walks into that room, I think all of us were like, oh, shit. But a lot of people ask, is that it? He tells her to get the fuck out and the shit that they had wasn't real. But I can't imagine Gia coming all the way to Chicago, having this scene with Leti and Atticus in the dining room and not playing a role in future episodes.
I'll be bummed. Y'all know how much I love her character. I think she's fantastic, and I will be super bummed if she's gone.
More awkward moments coming your way. All right. Now it's time for email and voicemail. And thank you so much to everybody who wrote in at hosts@shatontv.com or called in and left a message.
Yeah, and just a heads up about email, Big D is going to be uploading all of the emails from the season thus far onto the website over the next couple of days. And I will be on there, shatontv.com, and I will be responding, to everybody, whether we read your email on the podcast or not. We always do a personal response, and we love to have conversations with you on there. It's a different platform. So please know if we have not read your voicemail on here, or if you missed it being read on our Shappy Hour, it is going to be posted to the website, and I will be responding in kind. But the first one we have is from Chris, and it's entitled Needle Drops. He writes, "Hey gang, love your commentary on Lovecraft Country more than I do Lovecraft Country. My email is about the show's use of needle drops. For those that don't know, I mean their use of pre-existing songs not composed for the show. Lovecraft Country writer number 1. So, the opening of the scene, guys, is going to be the funeral for Emmett Till. What song should we play under a scene whose background is one of the most devastating, grotesque crimes in American history? Lovecraft Country writer number 2. Isn't the answer obvious? The new wave post-disco dance pop hit Cruel Summer by the British band Bananarama. Obviously, because it's summer and Emmett Till's murder was a cruel event. We, the writers of Lovecraft Country, are truly masters of subtlety and tact." Now, if you're going to do a needle drop out of time, it has to either be in line with the themes or tone of the overall piece. Case in point, Billie Holiday's somber song about racism from the 1950s plays 2016's Birth of a Nation, a somber film about slavery set in the 1800s. If you're going to have multiple needle drops, they should be similar in tone, theme, or genre. I'm sorry, but you can't just have Marilyn Manson, Alice Smith, Bananarama, and Cardi B on the same soundtrack without creating a world that feels like it can accommodate all these tones and textures. It doesn't help that the needle drop sounds nothing like the original score. Rather than feeling like a part of the world, I hear them, I just go, I'm currently listening to a Marilyn Manson song. Soundscape is an important part of creating a world, and this show's soundscape to me is pure auditory noise. Am I nitpicking here? Is there a method to the madness I'm missing? Keep it up with the good work, y'all. Chris. So I really liked this. Everybody knows my complaint about Bodak Yellow being played in the stiletto sodomy scene. I had a huge problem with that one. And I also went, when this episode opened up to A Cruel Summer and they were all in line for Emmett Till's funeral. I don't think everything in the show works because no show is perfect, right? I mean, you get a random perfect show like The Wire, but that happened how long ago? You know, I mean, it's not every now and again that you get these perfect shows. So I do appreciate them trying something like this, but I do agree with you, Chris. It is really hit or miss this season in terms of whether or not these anachronistic music moments are matching up with 1955 horror.
Yeah, and it's so tough after you watch something like Watchmen, where the soundtrack was so consistent and actually composed for the show by Nine Inch Nails. I mean, you're never going to get, I think, any better than that. I think it worked sometimes and sometimes it didn't. But what is interesting to note is the way that they'll bring back a song from episode to episode and change it slightly too. So like in this one, we saw I Put a Spell on You, which was different from the version that was played earlier in the series. And I think it's meant to show a shift in tone or a shift in relationship. So perfect, no, intentional. Yeah.
But don't thank Chris yet, Jean, because we have a second email from Chris. And we don't normally do this. We don't normally read from the same person on the same podcast. But because Jean and I liked the Emmett Till piece so much, we thought it might be important to have a different opinion. Because I've actually seen a lot of people online, and even on our instant Twitch stream, there were some people who didn't feel the same about the Emmett Till reference. And I think Chris kind of encapsulates those thoughts here. And he says, hey, I don't know if I'm breaking the rules by sending a second email, but I have thoughts and I didn't want to lay an essay on you. I really didn't like the show's handling of Emmett Till. It felt cheap. He's essentially just an extra in previous extras, isn't mentioned for a while, and then his death happens and we're supposed to feel bad. And if you know the event, you will feel probably really bad. But so much of the episode is devoted to his murder, you'd think he was just a series regular. Maybe I wouldn't feel this disappointment if he was. It might have been better if they just left him out of the show altogether. This cheap middle ground feels like an easy, fast way to appeal to the audience's pathos. Ultimately, I think this is a manifestation of King B's concern from episode 1 of the show's ability to balance eldritch horror with real-life horror. The cutting between the two prevents either from reaching its full potential. Am I off here? If I am, please let me know. Chris.
Now, Chris, I'm on the record as saying, earlier when the way they threw Emmett Till in as what we thought was an Easter egg, I thought it was a terrible treatment of a very serious topic. With this episode, it's with purpose because it gives Dee her entire storyline going into this, right? So now you see that her mother is gone. Her father is gone. She has no support system. And then she has to deal with a something. And that something is the death of a friend. Yeah, it could have been played out differently, but I think that it was important. Also, if you're going to have a show set in Chicago at the time, I think that having this monumental moment in Chicago history, it's a no-brainer. You've got to absolutely do it. And I should say that I'm grateful that a show that is set in horror with the effects budget that they do have did not make an attempt at actually depicting the body in the open casket. That would have been, to me, a step too far.
Oh, completely. And I have to say, if you're going to set a show in 1955 about race relations, you have to at least mention Emmett Till because that was the huge moment of 1955. So maybe they could have handled it differently, but I don't know how you make a show in this time period and not include him because he was so crucial to this time period in American history. But thank you, Chris, so much for both of those emails. The next one comes from our good friend, Stephen W., health fitness professional. One of our longtime fans. We love him, part of the Shat family. And he's writing in with an email entitled Family Links. Hello, Ash and Jean. First off, thank you for covering this show. I love everything you guys do, even when I disagree on your takes. Shat on TV has made the shows you cover more enjoyable. Hell, I even like Game of Thrones Season 8 because of your podcast. So to my point, the entire time I've always wondered how there was a family connection between Christina and Tick. Like, what did I miss? I just roll with it as something that was said and I didn't catch because of my extreme ADHD. Seriously, if you ever wonder what the fuck is up with that guy, yeah, I really had ADHD. And as an adult, it's bad. This episode, she called him her cousin. So really, what did I miss? Did Christina's great-grandparent impregnate Ticks? Stephen Whitcomb, health fitness professional.
Yeah, almost, Steve. Pretty damn close. After we covered episode 2, I believe it was, when we were introduced to Titus Braithwaite, I did a little bit of a breakdown in the deep dive to talk about this relationship between Tick and Christina Braithwaite and why Tick is so important to Christina and Samuel Braithwaite. The reason why is that the reason why is that Samuel Braithwaite and Christina Braithwaite are not direct descendants of Titus Braithwaite. They are distant cousins, right? So they are part of the Braithwaite family, but Titus Braithwaite impregnated Hannah, who then escaped as the lodge imploded during the first event at the lodge where Titus died. She carried that bloodline with her, and Atticus is therefore a direct descendant of Titus Braithwaite. Christina and Samuel's magic and their birthright, by comparison, is actually relatively weak. And that's why she calls him cousin. She is, in fact, a cousin to the actual bloodline of Titus Braithwaite. That's how it breaks down.
And there were a lot of people who saw it too as like almost like a dismissive thing as well. Like there were a lot of, references in the 1950s that were meant to belittle. And a lot of people were also saying like her saying it the way she did was meant to belittle him.
Oh, yeah. I did not mean by any means to imply that it was a tone of respect or anything like that. I think, yeah.
Just in case Steve's ADHD is acting up again, I'll just repeat it.
And from the email, we move on to the voicemail. And the first voicemail comes from an anonymous listener.
Hello. This is for Lovecraft Country, the review. You guys had about episode 7 or in general for the show in general. I just want to say that I very much enjoy listening to you guys' podcast. I listen to it every single week for Lovecraft Country. And I am not on Twitch. I did not hear any negative feedback or whatever was going on, but apparently some went down. I just wanted to say that I am a Black woman. And I enjoy Lovecraft Country, but I also had questions about episode 7. It resonated with me as a Black woman, the journey that Hippolyta was going on, and I appreciated it. But I personally had questions about how it fit within the overall story. So I don't think that you all are wrong for questioning certain things, and I don't know everything isn't for everyone, but I don't think that you can question what should be questioned, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So thank you. I enjoy listening to the podcast, and we'll continue to. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Anonymous. I really appreciate this because I agree. I got a message on Instagram that was like, you're a woman. How can you not respond to Hippolyta, at least in that way? And it's like, guys, I did. Like, I just like our caller said, I get that part of it. Like, I understand. I even said on the podcast, the whole thing about being a mom and losing your identity, being a wife and losing your identity. I get all of that. But like our caller here, it's just, was this the story that needed to be told when we've got an awesome story like we did this week?
And the only sense I can make of it, really, aside from it making a big statement about identity, that concept of shrinking, which I really, really appreciated. It was very educational for me. It put into words something that I had noticed in life, but never had the right term for. And I think that's mark of great literature and art. And I think the way that it connects to the show, the most sense that I can make of it, if we're going to say, how does it fit that entire undercurrent, is it did set us up for what happens in the wake of the absence of Hippolyta, which is Dee is left all by herself, right? Hippolyta had to be removed from the storyline to leave Dee so isolated. And this episode derives a lot of its power from her loneliness. And as you said, Ash, just her invisibility and not knowing how to navigate the world. And our final voicemail comes from Jeff in Alaska.
Hey guys, this is Jeff in Alaska again. And, I'm not really concerned whether you put this on the air or not. But I got done listening to your I Am podcast from Lovecraft Country. And I just wanted to let you know that I share, or I don't know if you're enraged, but I certainly am. Just the overall feedback that you seem to be getting, it just pisses me off. I listen to your podcast. First of all, I've been listening to your podcast ever since Game of Thrones came on, and I found you, and I love you guys. One of the things that I listen to you guys for is specifically to learn other things about what I'm watching and other things that I need to learn. That's exactly what you guys are doing with Lovecraft Country. The literary references and other resources, I don't have time to look that all up. I really appreciate you guys doing that research. I love to hear from the other callers, adding to that and adding their own cultural experience. And anybody who has a problem with that is just mental. You hear that, guys? You have a problem with that? You're mental. These people are doing this podcast for free, for their own enjoyment. They don't have an agenda. They're not pushing any propaganda. They're just entertained, and they're trying to keep contact with thousands, I hope, tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people who also like to be entertained and informed and share the experience. So you got a problem with it, get over it, keep it to yourselves. Don't bust on my Shat folks because they don't deserve it. Rant over. Love you guys.
We love you, Jeff from Alaska. First of all, I just think it's so crazy. You know, we look every week at we get voicemails from Alaska. We got emails from Australia this week. It's always just insane to me that you and I are doing this side project and that all these people not only listen to us, but have deep seated attachments to the show. It makes me feel really honored, and then it makes me nervous, and then it makes me feel honored again, and then all of those things. And so your support, Jeff, and everybody out there. Jean mentioned that there are thousands out there listening that aren't writing in angry things, and this is just indicative of that, of another listener. It makes us feel good. It makes the research easier. It makes doing this easier because we want to do it to be a part of your community, and we appreciate the support.
Two things. One, I want Jeff as my defense attorney. Mm-hmm. Very, very compelling argument. I don't mind getting the negative feedback. Honestly, I think that it's very helpful in making the product better. At the same time, if I dare call us entertainers, there's nothing that makes your life easier as an entertainer as people making you feel like you're doing something right. Because then you get on a roll, you're getting confident, then fun stuff happens, And people write in all the time or ask us all the time on Discord, why are you guys so much fun on movies and why are you no fun on TV? Well, it's because it's really hard to make a mistake on movies, and if you do, everyone laughs about it. When you make a mistake on TV, people are not laughing. And so we've been very fortunate, I think, with previous seasons of shows that people were at least understanding of our gaffes. And, we did our whole actuallys there. But Jeff, I do appreciate you writing in. I appreciate everybody writing in with the feedback. And it's okay. Even though we do this as a hobby and even though it's something that we do for free, it's okay to let us know when we're wrong. But also, please understand that we're doing our best. And I think that's become the mantra for the last 3 episodes is I'm doing my best.
And it's good. I like your best, Jean.
It's good. Thank you. I like your best too.
Thank you.
All right. So that wraps it up for the email and voicemail. Again, if you want to write in, you can write us at host@shatontv.com or call in at 914-719-SHAT. If you didn't hear your voicemail or email on this podcast, there's a very good chance it'll show up during Shappy Hour, which is our Friday night cocktail party. You can join us at 9 p.m. Eastern on Twitch, shatontv.com/Twitch. And guys, if you missed that, it's totally okay because it's also on Twitch for the week after it airs. And then it'll also be on YouTube as well. So you can catch it there. So please check that all out. One warning, if you don't like our unfiltered opinions, maybe don't watch that. Just listen to the podcast. And that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Lovecraft Country. We hope you enjoyed it and will join us next week for more. Be sure to follow us on social media and share it with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcast. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us, host@shatontv.com, or call 914-719-SHAT. You can also catch us on Twitch at shatontv.com/Twitch. Also, be sure to check out our sister podcast, Shat the Movies, where we join our good friend Big D, Dick Ebert, to cover 80s and 90s movies commissioned by you, the listeners. You can find past and future episodes at shatthemovies.com. This week, we are doing Maximum Overdrive, wherever fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a 5-star review. That helps the podcast grow. On behalf of my co-hosts, Ash Schlafly, the King Bee, and Big D Dick Ebert, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us on Friday for Shappy Hour and Sunday for another Lovecraft Country Live. Thanks for listening, and vote.
Bye, y'all.